July 2020, San Francisco's Dogpatch District. The demolition was routine until the crane's claw scraped against metal where blueprints showed only rooftop. It had punctured a massive, long-forgotten steel water-curing tank, a silent industrial sarcophagus. As the metal skin peeled back, the workers peered into the dark, dry void. What lay inside wasn't rust or sediment. It was the complete skeleton of a woman, preserved in the oxygen-starved air, still dressed in the tattered remains of a 1990s business suit. At that moment, the case of the disappearance of Linda Marsh, the brilliant accountant who had vanished 23 years prior, was reopened. January 22nd, 1997. Los Angeles was damp with a winter chill. For Linda Marsh, it was a day like any other, governed by a logic as precise as the ledgers she managed. At 35, she was the senior accountant at a prestigious firm, a woman whose quiet ambition was matched only by her almost supernatural talent for finding patterns in chaos. Her colleagues saw a meticulous professional, a mind that operated on a higher plane of numerical clarity. They knew nothing of her private life. It was a black box, sealed as tightly as her briefcase. Her days were a contest of intellect, a silent, high-stakes game played against the market, against error, and, most acutely, against her primary rival, Denise Caldwell. Publicly, they were the firm's star duo, their friendship a testament to professional respect. Privately, it was a war of attrition. Denise's brilliance was methodical, built on process and brute force. Linda's was intuitive, a kind of genius that saw the answer before the equation was even complete. It was a difference that quietly infuriated Denise, and one Linda was acutely aware of. For weeks, Linda had been consumed by a complex internal audit. She called it Project Nightingale. It was an impossibly intricate web of transactions that to everyone else looked like perfect, unremarkable accounting. But Linda saw something else. A flaw, an elegant, almost artistic deception that was so perfect it had to be deliberate. She told no one, not even Denise, that she was on the verge of uncovering what she privately considered a masterpiece of financial fraud. It was the kind of intellectual challenge she lived for. That evening, her neighbor saw her pull her modest sedan into the driveway of her Sherman Oaks home. The motions were familiar, routine. She collected the mail from the box, her posture straight, her movements economical. She walked to the front door, turned the key, and stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Inside, her purse and keys landed on the kitchen counter next to the stack of unopened mail. A half-eaten salad waited in the refrigerator. Her planner for the next day was open on her desk, the first appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock. The next morning, her car hadn't moved. The mail remained unopened. Linda Marsh, a woman defined by her precision and her presence, was simply gone. It was as if she had been neatly erased from the equation of her own life. The silence that fell over her home that night would last for 23 years. The jurisdiction fell to the San Francisco Police Department. Within hours, the rooftop of the derelict warehouse was a quarantined zone, a sterile island of methodical inquiry floating above the city. Detective Miriam Cho of the Cold Case Unit took the lead. She was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who viewed unsolved homicides not as tragedies, but as complex systems of logic waiting to be decoded. The tank was her new problem, a steel cylinder containing a 23-year-old answer. The forensic team worked with surgical precision under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. The environment inside the tank was an anomaly, dry, cool, and almost entirely sealed from the elements. The body had not decayed. It had desiccated, the skin and tissue turning to a leathery parchment over the bone. The clothing, a ghost of a 1990s power suit, was brittle but largely intact, a time capsule preserving the victim's final moments. Every fiber, every dust particle was collected and catalogued. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the medical examiner's office. The preliminary report came back within a day. Dental records provided a match to Los Angeles missing person file number 7499B, Linda Marsh. Cause of death was inconclusive due to the state of the remains, but the examiner noted a hairline fracture on the posterior of the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Time of death was estimated between January and February of 1997. Back at the lab, the clothing yielded the investigation's first true enigma. Tucked deep inside the inner breast pocket of the blazer, shielded from the elements, was a single object. It wasn't a wallet, a key, or a pen. It was a chess piece. A black knight, hand-carved from heavy, polished ebony. It was a custom piece, weighted and perfectly balanced. It was cold, smooth, and showed no signs of decay. It felt less like evidence and more like a statement. For Detective Cho, this single object shattered any theory of a simple, impulsive crime. The questions began to multiply, each one colder and more complex than the last. Why was a Los Angeles accountant found 380 miles away in a San Francisco warehouse? Who had access to this specific industrial site in 1997? Who knew this rooftop tank was empty, and that it would remain undisturbed for over 2 decades? The logistics of moving a body from Sherman Oaks to the Dogpatch district, undetected, were staggering. And then there was the night. It was a calling card, a symbol deliberately left behind, a piece from a game. Cho stood in the sterile silence of the evidence room, looking at the photograph of the single ebony piece. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was an engineering project. The transportation, the concealment, the choice of location, it was all executed with chilling precision. This wasn't the work of a panicked killer. It was the work of a strategist. The case file for Linda Marsh was no longer about a woman who vanished. It was about a woman who was checkmated. Detective Cho requested the original case files from the LAPD. They arrived in 2 heavy, dust-covered archival boxes, the paper inside yellowed and brittle. Reading through the typed reports from 1997 was like watching a ghost story unfold in slow motion. The initial investigation into Linda Marsh's disappearance wasn't just a failure. It was a masterclass in how a perfectly executed crime can neutralize law enforcement. The first officers on the scene in Sherman Oaks had found a pristine puzzle. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints other than Linda's, no overturned furniture, no blood, no evidence of a struggle whatsoever. Her car was in the garage, her purse and keys on the kitchen counter. It was a scene devoid of violence, a vacuum of information. The official report concluded that Linda Marsh had, for all intents and purposes, simply ceased to exist within the 4 walls of her own home. Faced with a complete absence of physical evidence, the LAPD detectives of the 1990s did what any investigator would do. They focused on the victim's life. They interviewed colleagues at the firm who described Linda as brilliant, reserved, and intensely private. They spoke to her distant family, who admitted they hadn't truly understood her adult life. The investigation turned into a search for a secret, a hidden lover, a gambling debt, a reason for a 35-year-old woman to abandon a successful career and a meticulously ordered existence. They found nothing. Their best and only lead was a volatile ex-boyfriend Linda had dated a year prior. He had a history of jealous outbursts and, according to friends, was an avid amateur chess player. To the original detectives, this felt like a promising connection. They dedicated hundreds of man-hours to him, building a psychological profile and tracking his movements. But their theory collapsed against a simple, irrefutable fact. The ex-boyfriend had moved to Oregon a full month before Linda vanished and had a concrete alibi for the entire week of her disappearance. With their only person of interest cleared and no new leads, the case went cold. It stalled not from incompetence, but from a profound lack of traction. The perpetrator had left behind a perfect void, a crime scene so clean it suggested no crime had occurred at all. The investigation was not obstructed by powerful people making phone calls. It was obstructed by an intellect that had anticipated every move the police would make and had engineered a situation where standard procedure was useless. The silence of 1997 wasn't negligence. It was the sound of a game being won so decisively that one player never even realized they were on the board. The investigation branched into two parallel paths, one that looked back at the people and one that looked back at the paper. Detective Cho's team began tracking down former employees of the Los Angeles firm, now scattered across the country, retired or in the twilight of their careers. The interviews were a study in the fallibility of memory. Most recalled Linda Marsh as a quiet prodigy, an intellectual force who kept to herself. They spoke of Denise Caldwell with a mixture of awe and unease, remembering her as brilliant, charming, but possessing a chilling, almost reptilian stillness. One retired partner, interviewed over a video call from his home in Arizona, hesitated for a long moment. "Friends, I suppose," he said, his voice thin. They were inseparable. But it wasn't a warm friendship. It was competitive. Like two grandmasters who respected each other's skill, but were always playing to win. Linda had the talent, but Denise had the will. Their memories were vague, clouded by 23 years of life, yet a consistent picture emerged. A relationship of intense, almost suffocating intellectual rivalry, masked as a professional alliance. Simultaneously, a separate team began a deep dive into the archives. They petitioned the LAPD to unseal all evidence from 1997, including the hard drive from Linda Marsh's office computer. It was an antiquated piece of technology, a digital fossil. Forensics experts began the painstaking process of trying to resurrect data from its corrupted sectors. Concurrently, analysts sifted through mountains of corporate records from the accounting firm, client lists, expense reports, internal memos, personnel files from an era before everything was digitized. It was a search for a needle in a continent of haystacks. They were looking for any connection, no matter how tenuous, between Linda's world in Los Angeles and the derelict warehouse in San Francisco. They cross-referenced every name associated with Linda and Denise, colleagues, clients, vendors, against property and corporate records for the Dogpatch warehouse. For weeks, the work yielded nothing but dead ends and meaningless coincidences. Then, a junior analyst flagged a potential link. The warehouse, it turned out, was owned by a small, defunct logistics company, which was itself a subsidiary of a larger holding corporation. He had been meticulously mapping the board members of that corporation from the 1997 fiscal year. One name, a man named Julian Croft, seemed unremarkable. But that same name appeared on another, far more obscure document. A single-page guest list from a private strategy seminar hosted by Denise Caldwell in late 1996. The event was off the books, held at a private club. The list had been found in an old box of Denise's event planning materials, misfiled and forgotten. It was a faint connection, a whisper in a storm of data. A board member of the company that owned the warehouse was also an attendee at one of Denise's exclusive private gatherings. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the first thread connecting Denise Caldwell directly to the place where Linda Marsh's body was found. The name Julian Croft became the new center of gravity for the investigation. For weeks, Detective Cho and her team operated under a compelling, logical, and entirely incorrect theory. Croft, the ruthless businessman on the board of the company that owned the warehouse, was now their prime suspect. The narrative they constructed was plausible. Linda Marsh, during her Project Nightingale audit, hadn't discovered Denise's internal embezzlement, but a much larger fraudulent deal involving Croft's logistics company. Denise, they theorized, was merely the connector, an unwitting or perhaps self-interested party who arranged a meeting between the two. That meeting, they concluded, had turned fatal. The investigation pivoted with force. They dedicated all resources to excavating Julian Croft's past. He had died of a heart attack in 2008, But his professional life left a deep paper trail. They uncovered records showing his company was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1996, a crisis it miraculously survived. They found depositions from old lawsuits painting him as a man who would go to any length to silence a threat. He had the motive, financial desperation, and he had the means, a vacant, forgotten industrial property in San Francisco. The Ebony Knight, in this version of the story, was a piece of misdirection, a flourish added by Denise to point the original investigators toward Linda's chess-playing ex-boyfriend while she and Croft cleaned up their mess. The team felt a surge of confidence. They believed they were finally unraveling the conspiracy. They were building a posthumous case against a powerful man, with Denise Caldwell cast in a secondary role as a terrified accomplice or a cold-blooded facilitator. The puzzle pieces seemed to fit. The theory held for 17 days. It collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon with the arrival of a single, concise report from the SFPD's Digital Forensics Unit. After weeks of meticulous work, they had managed to reconstruct a corrupted file fragment from the evidence locker hard drive of Linda Marsh's 1997 computer. It was a draft of an email written by Linda that had never been sent. It was addressed to no one, but its content was a lightning strike. The recovered text was short, but it reframed the entire 23-year-old mystery. It read, "The theft is a work of art, but I see the flaw in your knight's gambit. We need to talk. Denise." The Croft theory evaporated in an instant. The message wasn't about corporate fraud. It was intimate, a direct address between two intellectual equals. The phrase, "your knight's gambit," was not a random detail. It was a specific, personal accusation. Julian Croft wasn't the king in this game. He was, at best, a rook, moved into position by a far more dangerous player. Detective Cho stared at the words on the screen. The investigation had been looking at the wrong opponent all along. The email fragment was the Rosetta Stone. Your knight's gambit. In the world of chess, a gambit is a sacrifice made in the opening moves to gain a positional advantage. For Detective Cho, the phrase unlocked the entire psychological framework of the crime. Linda Marsh hadn't just uncovered embezzlement, she had recognized it as a strategic move in a larger game, and she had named her opponent Denise. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed, it was a crime of intellectual vanity. With this new lens, Cho revisited the guest list from Denise Caldwell's 1996 strategy seminar. The names were cross-referenced again, this time with a focus on finding a living, breathing witness. Most were dead. But one, Arthur Vance, a retired architect, was alive and living in a quiet retirement community in Napa Valley. He was the weakest link in a chain that had held for over 2 decades. Cho and her partner drove north, the air thick with the sense of an impending checkmate. They found Vance tending to his rose bushes, a frail man in his late 70s. When Cho introduced herself and mentioned Linda Marsh's name, he didn't react with surprise or confusion. A wave of weary, bone-deep resignation washed over his face. He simply put down his pruning shears, looked at the detectives and said, "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Inside his sterile, minimalist home, he spoke for 2 hours, his voice a dry whisper, finally unburdening himself of a 23-year-old secret. He told them about the Strategists' Circle. It was an informal club, he explained, a collection of arrogant professionals from various fields, finance, law, engineering, architecture. They weren't criminals. They were amoral elitists, bound by a shared belief that they were smarter than everyone else. They saw life as a series of complex games, and morality was just another variable to be manipulated for a more elegant outcome. Denise Caldwell, with her cold, perfect logic, was their unofficial queen. Then came the confession that connected every loose thread. In late January of 1997, Denise had convened a private meeting with a few core members, including Vance and Julian Croft. She didn't present a problem of a dead body, She presented a logistical puzzle. The challenge was purely theoretical: how to make an object the size and weight of an adult human vanish from a secure location in Los Angeles and never be found. There was no mention of murder, no names, just the cold, abstract challenge. They embraced it. It was the ultimate game. Croft, proud of his portfolio of underutilized assets, suggested the sealed water tank on the roof of his company's derelict San Francisco warehouse as the perfectly elegant solution: isolated, inaccessible, and permanent. They helped her arrange the transport, viewing their complicity as nothing more than a thrilling intellectual exercise. The motive, Cho now understood, wasn't just to silence Linda Marsh. The disposal of her body was the final move in Denise's game, a demonstration of absolute intellectual supremacy. Linda had discovered her secret, so Denise erased Linda from the board, not with panicked violence, but with cold, detached, and brilliant precision. Based on Arthur Vance's testimony and the forensic evidence, the final hours of Linda Marsh's life could finally be reconstructed. The timeline of the tragedy was not one of chaotic violence, but of cold, calculated precision. It began not with a broken door, but with a phone call. Shortly after arriving home, Linda received a call from Denise Caldwell. It wasn't a threat. It was a summons, an invitation to a final face-to-face meeting at Denise's starkly modern office. "You found it," Denise likely said, her voice calm. "Let's finish the game." Appealing to Linda's own intellectual pride was the perfect lure. Linda drove herself to the meeting, leaving her pristine home to become a 23-year-old riddle. The confrontation took place in Denise's world, a minimalist space of glass and steel where she held all the power. There, Linda laid out her findings, detailing the elegant, almost invisible embezzlement scheme, the Knight's Gambit. Denise did not deny it. According to Vance, who heard the story from Denise herself, she calmly confirmed it, almost congratulating Linda on her brilliance. It was the ultimate act of psychological dominance. This wasn't a confession. It was the acknowledgement of one grandmaster to another that the game had reached its final, critical stage. For a moment, Linda must have believed she had won. Her victory was an illusion. It was the fatal miscalculation of a brilliant mind that could not comprehend true immorality. As Linda turned, believing the intellectual duel was over and the next step was a formal report, the air behind her moved with sudden, silent speed. There was no scream, only a single definitive sound, a heavy, muffled impact that was more felt than heard. The world for Linda Marsh went instantly, completely black. She fell to the floor, the victim not of rage, but of a ruthlessly logical decision. Denise's actions that followed were devoid of panic. Her breathing remained steady. This was not the aftermath of a murder, it was the execution of a pre-planned solution. She knelt, not in remorse, but with the focus of a craftsman completing their work. She retrieved the single hand-carved ebony knight from her desk. With deliberate care, she reached into Linda's blazer and tucked the chess piece deep into the inner pocket. It was her signature, a final, silent declaration of checkmate. Within the hour, a nondescript van arrived, dispatched by Julian Croft as part of the logistical puzzle. The transfer was executed with practiced efficiency. Linda Marsh's body, wrapped and secured, began its journey north up Interstate 5. It was 380 miles of cold, unremarkable darkness, a simple delivery from one point to another. In the pre-dawn hours, the van arrived at the silent Dogpatch warehouse. Using a service crane, the body was hoisted to the roof. It was lowered into the dry, cavernous void of the water-curing tank. Then, the final move. A series of bolts were tightened. A heavy lid was welded shut, sealing Linda Marsh and Denise's secret away from the world. For 23 years, it was the perfect crime, hidden not in a shallow grave, but in a monument to industrial indifference. Armed with Arthur Vance's sworn testimony, Detective Cho obtained a search warrant for Denise Caldwell's minimalist glass house in the Marin Headlands. When confronted after 23 years of silence, Denise, now in her late 50s and a respected financial guru, showed no emotion. She regarded Cho with a look of bored appraisal, a queen studying a pawn that had unexpectedly crossed the board. "Detective," she said, her voice a flat line of confidence, "you can't prove a single thing. The board was cleared decades ago." Her arrogance was her final mistake. During the methodical search of her home office, investigators found a small, velvet-lined box in a hidden safe behind a framed philosophy print. It was not for jewelry or documents. Inside, resting on dark silk, was a complete, custom-made ebony chess set. Every piece was perfectly crafted and in its place, except for one. There was a single, empty indentation where a black knight was supposed to be. It was the irrefutable physical link, the trophy from a game she thought she had won permanently. The trial of Denise Caldwell became a media sensation, the final chapter in the story of the ghost of Sherman Oaks. The other living members of the strategist's circle, now elderly and stripped of their intellectual bravado by the very real threat of prison, turned on their queen. One by one, they testified for the prosecution, their voices frail with fear as they detailed the logistical puzzle of 1997. Their amoral game had finally collided with the stark reality of the law. Denise Caldwell maintained her cold composure throughout the proceedings, viewing the trial as one last, flawed game she was being forced to play. But the evidence, the email fragment, Vance's testimony, and the damning image of the incomplete chess set was overwhelming. A jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Linda Marsh's few surviving relatives, now elderly themselves, the verdict was a distant, hollow echo of justice. They issued a brief statement thanking the San Francisco Police Department, but declined further comment. The legal system had provided an answer, a conviction that filled in the 23-year-old void with a name and a motive. But it could not restore a life, nor could it erase the decades of silent, unanswered grief. The San Francisco warehouse was torn down a year after the trial. In its place now stands a biotech lab, a gleaming structure of glass and steel dedicated to the meticulous study of life, built over the very spot where a story of death was sealed for 23 years. In Sherman Oaks, Linda Marsh's former home has been sold and remodeled twice. New families have lived and laughed within its walls, unaware of the silent question that once defined them. Denise Caldwell resides in the California Institution for Women. Her world, once a vast board for her intellectual games, has been reduced to a 6-by-9-foot concrete cell. There are no strategy sessions, no acolytes, no elegant puzzles to solve. There is only the unchangeable reality of the verdict, a logic she cannot manipulate or outwit. The ebony knight, the symbol of her perfect gambit, sits under fluorescent lights in an SFPD evidence locker. It is logged as Exhibit 1138. A piece without a board, its purpose fulfilled, its story finally told. It is no longer a symbol of power, but a cold, hard fact. This case was never about passion or money or revenge in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration of a terrifying idea, that a human being can be reduced to a problem to be solved, a variable to be eliminated. It was a 23-year testament to the silence that follows a perfectly executed move. Denise Caldwell believed she won when she cleared the board. She was wrong. She forgot the most fundamental rule. Once the game is over, all the pieces, including the queen, go back in the box.